Donovan Reddick had barely stepped out of the unmarked sport utility vehicle when 10 rifles rose in unison and locked onto his chest. His dark jacket, the pistol on his hip, and a vague radio description were enough for the federal team to decide they had just found the leader of a hostage crisis. They drove him face first into the pavement, snapped handcuffs around his wrists, and never once reached for the badge sitting in his breast pocket. Inside the warehouse behind them, the kidnappers had already begun executing hostages one by one. When the commanding agent finally understood his mistake, Donovan said only 4 words: "Take off the cuffs. I am in command now." The town of Belridge, Missouri, had never seen anything like the chaos unfolding at the edge of its old distribution center. A converted warehouse once used for regional freight storage had become the stage for an armed takeover that left 4 senior employees trapped inside, including a federal financial auditor named Lena Whitaker. For nearly 3 hours, a federal tactical team under Special Agent Grant Huxley had held the perimeter without knowing how many gunmen were inside, where the explosives were placed, or what the kidnappers actually wanted. Huxley was 47 years old, confident to the point of arrogance, and deeply allergic to outside interference in an operation he considered his own. Donovan arrived from the south that afternoon, following a trail that had nothing to do with the siege itself. He had spent weeks tracking Tobias Creed, a fugitive, under federal Marshal jurisdiction, a former private security contractor with tactical training and a documented history of evading capture. Donovan knew Tobias well enough to guess that whatever was happening inside that warehouse was not a random robbery gone wrong. Because interagency communication systems had not been synchronized that morning, Huxley's team had no idea the Marshal was inbound, and no one had cleared his approach through the perimeter checkpoints. An agent spotted Donovan stepping out of his vehicle, with a sidearm visible at his hip. The radio description of the suspect that had circulated for the past hour was almost useless. A man in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket, believed to be armed. It matched half the agents standing on that perimeter, and it matched Donovan Reddick perfectly. Huxley gave the order to subdue him before anyone bothered to ask a single question. Donovan did not resist. He raised both hands, stated his name, and ranked clearly and asked them to check the inner pocket of his jacket, where his credentials were sitting in plain sight. A younger agent kicked his legs apart and forced his face down against the asphalt anyway. Huxley snatched Donovan's wallet from his jacket, but did not bother to open it, convinced that any badge a suspect carried was likely counterfeit. He accused Donovan of trying to infiltrate the perimeter under false pretenses, ignoring the calm, steady voice beneath him that kept repeating the same warning. Donovan told him the team was focused on the wrong side of the building entirely, that he had already spotted a directional antenna mounted on the roof, evidence that the kidnappers were monitoring the very tactical channel Huxley's team was using to communicate. Huxley ignored him completely. A single gunshot cracked from inside the warehouse at that exact moment, and the entire perimeter went silent. Through the thermal camera feed, a hostage had just collapsed to the floor, and no one could tell whether the person was alive or already gone. Donovan, still cuffed and pinned against the ground, asked Huxley one question that stunned every agent standing nearby. He wanted to know whether anyone had checked the maintenance tunnel running beneath the eastern side of the building. Huxley said nothing because his team did not even know that tunnel existed. Marissa Vance, the negotiator assigned to the scene, picked up the wallet that had been tossed carelessly to the ground and opened it herself. Inside, beneath a photograph and a worn federal identification card, sat a badge that read, United States Marshal Service Senior Tactical Operations. She stared at it for a long moment before turning to look at the man still pinned beneath 2 agents in the dirt. Huxley ran the credential number through dispatch and received confirmation within minutes. Donovan Reddick was exactly who he claimed to be, a senior deputy marshal with years of hostage rescue experience and a personal history tracking Tobias Creed across 3 states. Huxley ordered the cuffs removed, but offered no apology, not even a word of acknowledgement for the mistake his team had just made. Donovan stood slowly, the red marks from the cuffs still visible on his wrists, and rather than argue about what had just happened, he asked to see the full layout of the scene. Huxley refused to hand over command, insisting Donovan could offer background on the fugitive, but had no authority over tactical decisions. Donovan studied the monitors anyway and found three critical errors within minutes. The sniper teams were focused entirely on a front window, where Tobias had deliberately placed a decoy silhouette to draw attention. The thermal cameras had a dead zone over the cold storage section on the western side of the building, and the hostages' phone signals were dropping out on a 7-minute cycle, a pattern that suggested a timed, jamming device rather than random interference. Marissa began to believe him. She asked why Tobias would have chosen this particular warehouse of all places, and Donovan explained that beneath the building ran a network of old transport tunnels connecting to an abandoned rail line. Tobias might not be planning to make a final stand at all. He might simply be buying time to prepare an escape route. Huxley dismissed the theory as speculation, but Donovan reached his partner, Deputy Marshal Callum Briggs, who confirmed within minutes that Tobias had stolen facility blueprints from the city planning office 3 days earlier. The evidence lined up perfectly with Donovan's read of the building. Inside the warehouse, Tobias filmed a bound hostage and sent the footage directly to police negotiators, demanding an armored vehicle, $10 million in cash, and a guaranteed exit within 90 minutes. Donovan looked at the demand and immediately recognized it as a distraction. Tobias did not need cash. What he actually wanted was to get Lena Whitaker and a hard drive she carried safely out of the city. Donovan asked Huxley, who had arranged for Lena's visit to this facility in the first place, and Huxley explained it had been scheduled as a surprise financial inspection. That answer troubled Donovan more than anything else he had heard so far. He suspected someone inside the federal system had leaked her schedule to the people now holding her hostage. Before he could press the question further, Tobias called into the negotiation line and asked to speak with the marshal who had chased him across 3 states. Somehow, Tobias already knew Donovan was standing on that perimeter. His voice came through cold and deliberate. "Marshal Reddick, if you want to know who sold out Inspector Whitaker, come in here alone." Huxley wanted nothing to do with letting Donovan speak to the hostage-taker directly, but pressure from above forced his hand since every available channel had to be used to keep the hostages alive. Marissa sat beside Donovan at the negotiation station and handed him a headset, quietly noting how carefully he controlled his breathing before saying a single word into the line. Tobias mocked him, immediately pointing out that he had Jennings handcuffed by his own colleagues. Proof, he said, that federal agencies destroyed themselves through bias, ego, and turf wars long before any outside enemy ever could. Donovan let the insult pass without a flicker of reaction. He asked to hear each hostage speak so he could confirm they were still alive. Tobias allowed only Lena to talk, and she said something that sounded ordinary to everyone else in the room. "The air in here is colder than I expected." Donovan understood immediately that it was a signal confirming she was being held near the cold storage section on the western side, the exact blind spot the thermal cameras could not reach. He stretched the conversation by circling back to the cash demand, and Tobias grew visibly impatient, further proof that money was never the true objective. While they talked, Donovan caught the faint sound of metal striking rail track and a distant train horn echoing through the line, confirming that Tobias was positioned near the southern tunnel entrance rather than the central section the Proscent Echo NS tactical team had been watching. Tobias then revealed that the hard drive in Lena's possession held evidence of a massive money laundering network built on falsified federal transportation contracts, one that had funneled hundreds of millions of dollars to corrupt officials and businessmen over the years. He claimed he was not simply a kidnapper, but a man trying to expose the truth. Donovan did not fully believe him, recognizing that a person could hold genuine evidence and still be willing to kill innocent people to force it into the open. Tobias delivered an ultimatum. In 45 minutes, Donovan had to bring a vehicle to the eastern entrance alone, and if any tactical team appeared, he would detonate the building immediately. After the call ended, Donovan laid out his read of the situation for the room. Tobias, he explained, did not fully control his own crew, and a second gunman had shouted something angry in the background during the call, suggesting at least one member of the group wanted to execute hostages immediately, regardless of any deal. Donovan believed the group was preparing to escape through the tunnel system, and the vehicle demand at the eastern entrance was designed purely to pull the tactical response away from their real exit point. Huxley rejected the theory and began preparing a frontal assault on the main entrance, instead ignoring Donovan's warning that the door was likely rigged with pressure-sensitive explosives. A reconnaissance robot confirmed it moments later, revealing detonation wire running from the front door to 4 chemical drums positioned just inside. Had Huxley launched his assault only minutes earlier, the entire breach team could have been killed instantly. Grant began to waver, but still refused to relinquish control of the operation, clinging to command, even as the evidence mounted against every decision he had made that day. Donovan told him plainly that liking him was never the point, but that if he kept protecting his own authority instead of the hostages, Tobias would win regardless of who technically held command. A security monitor suddenly flickered to life, showing Wesley Pike dragging a hostage into the center of the warehouse floor and pressing a gun against the man's head. Wesley, 34 years old, and far more volatile than his partner, had grown, convinced the outside forces were stalling for time to prepare an attack rather than negotiate in good faith. The hostage was Owen Prescott, a 55-year-old transportation company executive who kept insisting in a rising panic that he had nothing to do with whatever crime the negotiators believed had taken place there. Tobias stepped into frame and physically blocked Wesley from pulling the trigger, and the two men argued in a heated exchange the cameras captured without sound. Donovan studied their body language closely and recognized that Tobias was slowly losing control over his own crew. A single gunshot rang out a moment later, but the bullet struck the floor beside Owen's feet rather than his skull. Tobias, having redirected Wesley's aim at the last possible instant, the near miss exposed a fracture inside the group that Donovan intended to exploit. He proposed splitting the kidnappers apart by using the negotiation line to convince Wesley that Tobias was quietly planning to surrender him to authorities in exchange for his own freedom. Marissa agreed the plan had merit, while Huxley called it reckless and unpredictable. Before they could settle the argument, the camera feed cut out entirely as the jamming device switched to continuous interference. In the confusion, a local tactical unit that had not cleared its movement through command pushed into the northern side of the property and was met with gunfire from the roof, leaving one agent seriously wounded and the formation in disarray. Huxley issued a stream of contradictory orders, calling for retreat and suppressive fire in the same breath, leaving no one certain which instruction to follow first. Donovan moved toward the gunfire himself, using an armored vehicle for cover as he dragged the wounded agent to safety. He quickly recognized the rooftop shooter as a diversion, reasoning that if the tactical response concentrated all its attention up there, Tobias would use the opening to slip out through the tunnel system below. He instructed Callum to check the abandoned rail line immediately, and Callum located a refrigerated truck parked without license plates, just over half a mile from the tunnel exit. Huxley finally understood that Tobias had prepared his escape route long before the standoff had even begun. Then came word from command that a secondary explosive device had been discovered inside the warehouse, its timer counting down from 28 minutes. Huxley began preparing a full-scale assault, and Donovan objected immediately, warning that an outside attack would trigger both the bomb and the execution of the remaining hostages at once. Huxley snapped that Donovan had no authority to issue orders of any kind on this scene. At that exact moment, a call came through from Washington, and Assistant Director Elaine Sutter demanded to speak with Huxley directly. She confirmed that Donovan Reddick now held interagency tactical command of the operation under emergency authority, given both his jurisdiction over the fugitive and mounting concerns about an internal security leak. Huxley stood frozen as her voice carried through the speaker. Transfer full operational control to Marshal Reddick immediately. Donovan turned toward the very agents who had pinned him to the ground less than an hour earlier. He did not mention the humiliation did not demand an apology from anyone standing there. He simply asked for the layout of the building, reminding them that they had 26 minutes left to bring everyone out alive, and that every second spent arguing about rank was a second none of them could afford to lose. Donovan reorganized the entire response within minutes, splitting the remaining forces into 4 coordinated teams. He would personally lead the first group through the maintenance tunnel beneath the eastern side of the building. Marissa would run the second group, maintaining the negotiation line, while feeding Tobias false information to keep him distracted. A third team would move to secure the refrigerated truck, waiting at the rail line exit, and a fourth, made up of explosive ordnance specialists, would attempt to neutralize the detonation system from outside the structure. He kept Huxley inside the command post, but assigned him a critical role, coordinating the local units, ensuring no more agents entered the perimeter without authorization the way the earlier team had. Huxley understood it was not meant as an insult. Donovan was still using his experience, simply placing it where it could do the most good instead of the most damage. Donovan then noted that the 28-minute countdown might not represent a detonation time at all, but rather the arrival of a freight train scheduled to pass along the nearby line, a noise Tobias likely intended to use as cover for his escape. Callum checked the rail schedule and confirmed a freight train would pass through the area in exactly 23 minutes, 5 minutes sooner than the countdown suggested. Marissa called Tobias back and told him the vehicle was being prepared, deliberately mentioning Wesley in a tone that implied federal negotiators already had a separate arrangement with him. Wesley overheard the comment and began to suspect that Tobias was negotiating behind his back exactly as Donovan had hoped. Inside the cold storage section, Lena had quietly worked one hand loose from her restraints. She noticed that Owen seemed less afraid of being killed than of the possibility that Tobias might release the contents of that hard drive to the public. Owen confessed under his breath that his company had spent years moving cash through a network of falsified contracts, insisting he had been coerced into participating. Though Lena found the claim difficult to believe, given how calmly he described it. Donovan and 3 agents entered the tunnel, wading through water-pooled ankle, deep the darkness nearly complete around them. They discovered a series of homemade motion sensors positioned along the passage, and Donovan used a small pocket mirror to map the detection angles, guiding his team along the wall to slip past undetected. Ahead of them stood a steel door with exposed wiring running along the hinge, and one agent immediately suspected it was rigged to explode. Donovan examined the dust patterns on the floor and realized the door had been opened and closed, frequently, meaning the wiring more likely connected to a silent alarm rather than a bomb. He cut the correct wire and opened the path forward. The moment his team stepped through, Tobias's voice crackled over a hidden speaker system somewhere in the basement. "I knew you would take the tunnel, Donovan." The basement lights flared on, suddenly revealing dozens of fuel drums arranged along the walls, and a laser sensor sweeping directly across the path his team had just entered. Donovan signaled everyone to freeze in place, recognizing that the beam was wired into a secondary detonation system. Studying it more closely, he realized the sensor did not respond to motion at all, but to changes in body heat, meaning that moving quickly through it would trigger the explosive almost instantly. He ordered the ordnance team to open an industrial cooling line to lower the ambient temperature of the basement, hoping that once the room grew nearly as cold as their own water-soaked skin, the sensor would fail to register the difference as they crossed. One agent worried they would suffer hypothermia before reaching the other side, and Donovan told him plainly they had roughly 3 minutes before their muscles lost coordination entirely. The team moved slowly, carefully through the beam. Tobias kept talking over the hidden speaker, dragging up an old operation in Oklahoma, where Donovan had once arrested his older brother, a man Tobias claimed had died in custody because the federal system had simply abandoned him. Donovan recognized the tactic, immediately understanding that Tobias was trying to shatter his focus at the worst possible moment. He answered calmly that Tobias's brother had been offered witness protection and refused it, choosing instead to protect the money flowing through the very network Tobias now claimed to despise. Tobias fell silent for several seconds, and that silence told Donovan he had struck the truth. Above ground, Marissa kept working on Wesley, telling him over the phone that Tobias had privately arranged his own separate surrender terms. Furious Wesley dragged Lena out of cold storage and demanded Tobias hand over the hard drive immediately. Tobias refused, and the 2 men turned their weapons on each other, while the remaining crew members stood frozen, uncertain who to follow. In the chaos, Owen tried to slip away, but was struck down by one of the gunmen before he could reach an exit. Donovan reached a stairwell leading up to the main floor and noticed fresh boot prints alongside a thin trail of blood. Someone had been wounded but was still alive and moving. His team found a security guard shot through the shoulder hiding behind an electrical panel, who revealed that Tobias actually commanded 5 armed men rather than the three the tactical team had assumed. The guard also revealed something far more troubling. One of the hostages had never truly been a victim at all, having quietly opened the door for Tobias's crew before the siege even began. Donovan asked who it was, and the guard confirmed the name. Owen Prescott had let them in. The revelation confirmed that Owen was directly involved in the conspiracy from the very beginning, not merely an unlucky bystander caught in the crossfire. Donovan relayed the information to Marissa through an encrypted channel, warning her to keep Owen away from the hard drive at all costs, or trigger the contingency plan immediately if that failed. As Donovan prepared to move upward, Wesley suddenly shot down one of his own accomplices, a man still loyal to Tobias, and the gunfire sent the entire warehouse into fresh chaos. Tobias pulled Lena toward the southern tunnel, while Wesley held two remaining hostages as human shields on the main floor. Donovan faced an impossible choice, forced to decide between chasing Tobias to save Lena or confronting Wesley to save the two hostages standing directly in his path. He split his team and moved toward Wesley himself, judging the unstable gunman to be the more immediate threat to human life. Sheriff Nolan Mercer, who had worked alongside Donovan years earlier on a separate manhunt through the same county, arrived at the perimeter around this time and offered his local units to reinforce the outer containment. Donovan accepted the offer, but kept every additional unit well back from the building itself, unwilling to risk another uncoordinated breach like the one that had already cost them a wounded agent on the northern side. Nolan trusted Donovan's judgment without question, having seen firsthand years before how carefully the Marshal weighed every risk before committing to a plan, and he made sure his deputies understood they were there to hold the line, not to act on their own initiative. Wesley pressed the barrel of his gun against a hostage's skull and began counting down from 10, his voice shaking with the same volatility that had defined him from the beginning. Donovan watched through the gap in a doorway, noticing Wesley standing directly beneath an overhead conveyor system suspended from the ceiling. He radioed Huxley and asked him to activate the warehouse power grid for exactly 3 seconds before shutting it down again. Huxley did not fully understand the reasoning, but followed the order without hesitation. When the conveyor system jolted to life, the sudden mechanical noise startled Wesley enough to turn his head, and Donovan fired a single precise shot into the arm holding the weapon. Wesley still tried to fire with his remaining hand, and an agent rushed forward to pull the first hostage clear of the line of fire. Donovan closed the distance, knocked the barrel aside with the stock of his own rifle, and drove Wesley to the ground with controlled, deliberate force. Wesley pulled a hidden blade from inside his boot and lunged, cutting a shallow line across Donovan's forearm before Donovan locked his arm and forced him into submission. Both remaining hostages were pulled to safety within seconds, but Tobias had already disappeared into the tunnel system, with Lena and the hard drive still in his possession. Owen had vanished as well during the confusion, and Donovan quickly reasoned that he had not fled toward the exits at all, but was instead trying to reach the detonation system or destroy the remaining evidence himself. Huxley reported that the countdown had dropped to 11 minutes, and the ordnance team discovered the explosive could not be disarmed remotely since it relied on 2 separate circuits. One connected to Tobias's handheld trigger, and the other ran to a server inside the warehouse control room. Cutting only one circuit would leave the other fully capable of detonating the entire structure. Donovan handed control of the main floor to Huxley and Marissa and moved into the tunnel himself, one agent following close behind him. Before he left, Huxley stopped him for a moment and admitted quietly that he had been wrong to arrest him, wrong to ignore his warnings, and wrong to let his own pride put so many lives at risk. Donovan told him they would talk once every hostage was confirmed safe, and pushed forward into the tunnel without another word. Inside, Tobias dragged Lena toward the tunnel exit near the rail line, unaware that the 4th team had already secured the refrigerated truck waiting there. Lena tried to convince him to surrender the evidence to investigators through proper channels, and Tobias told her he had tried exactly that multiple times, only to watch every complaint quietly disappear into nothing. He believed only a public crisis could force the truth into the open where it could no longer be buried. Donovan appeared behind them and raised his weapon, telling Tobias he might well be right about the corruption, but that he was dead wrong to turn an innocent woman into a tool for exposing it. Tobias insisted Lena was not entirely innocent either, claiming she had signed off on closing an investigation 2 years earlier. Lena explained that she had been ordered to suspend the case for lack of evidence and had quietly continued digging on her own time, which was precisely why she had become a target in the first place. Tobias hesitated, the certainty draining from his expression for the first time since the standoff began. He looked down at the woman he had dragged through half the tunnel system, seeing for the first time not an enemy, but someone who had risked her own career trying to fix the very corruption he claimed to be fighting. And for a moment the gun in his hand seemed to lose its purpose entirely. In that instant, Owen emerged from a side passage and shot Tobias in the stomach. Tobias collapsed, the detonation trigger falling from his hand as he hit the ground. Owen turned his weapon on Lena and admitted without shame that he had funded Tobias's entire operation from the beginning, intending to use the hostage crisis to destroy the evidence against him and pin every crime on the armed crew he had hired. Tobias, it turned out, had only ever been a pawn. Owen picked the trigger up off the ground, a thin smile spreading across his face, despite the blood pooling beneath the wounded man beside him. "If that hard drive can never belong to me," he said, "then the entire warehouse can simply disappear with it." Owen kept Lena pressed close in front of him, the trigger clenched in one hand and a pistol in the other, leaving Donovan without any clean line of fire. Donovan stalled for time, asking why a wealthy executive would risk everything on a plan this reckless and this violent. Owen answered without hesitation, describing a laundering network that had operated for more than a decade, funneling hundreds of millions of dollars through falsified freight contracts to corrupt officials and complicit businessmen across the country. Lena, he admitted bitterly, had traced the final chain of transactions directly back to him personally. Tobias, still bleeding on the ground, but conscious, quietly worked a length of metal cable toward Owen's ankle. Donovan saw the movement, but gave nothing away, continuing to talk in order to hold Owen's full attention. When Owen shifted his weight backward, Tobias yanked the cable tight around his ankle, and Owen lost his balance completely. Lena threw herself sideways out of the line of fire. Donovan fired a single shot into the shoulder, holding the trigger, and the device dropped and skidded onto the rail track below. Owen fired wildly in response, and Donovan shoved Lena into a recessed alcove before knocking the pistol from Owen's remaining hand. Still desperate, Owen tried to crawl toward the fallen trigger, but Tobias, using the last of his strength, kicked the device further away, back toward Donovan. Donovan restrained Owen and handed him off to the agent beside him, before retrieving the trigger and checking its display. 4 minutes remained on the countdown. Tobias warned him weakly that the device in his hand controlled only the primary circuit and that Owen had already activated a secondary system inside the control room. Donovan radioed Huxley, immediately instructing him to locate the server responsible for the second trigger. Huxley and Marissa found the control room sealed behind a biometric lock keyed to Owen's fingerprint, and Owen refused outright to cooperate. Donovan considered bringing him to the panel by force, but there was no time left for that option. Lena remembered that the hard drive contained a copy of the administrative access codes used across the transportation network and wondered aloud whether the same credentials might unlock the control room door. Marissa connected the drive, but the system demanded a 12-character password neither of them could immediately produce. Owen laughed weakly from where he sat, restrained, certain they would never guess it in time. Donovan suddenly recalled something Tobias had said earlier during the negotiation about his brother dying because he refused to give up the network's money. He asked Tobias for the name of the very first shell company the laundering operation had used. Tobias answered with what strength he had left. Red Meridian Freight. Marissa typed in the letters, but the system still required one final character. Lena remembered the company had been registered in the year 2014 and added the final digit to complete the password. The system accepted it instantly, and the control room door slid open with just 1 minute and 12 seconds left on the countdown. Huxley and the ordnance team rushed inside and found the trigger wired to a pressure sensor, meaning the cable could not simply be cut without risk. Donovan instructed them not to sever the connection at all, but instead to trick the system into believing the pressure inside the fuel containment tank remained stable. Huxley connected a signal simulator by hand while the clock ticked down through 30 seconds. Then 20, the readings fluctuating wildly with every adjustment. Marissa held the connection steady, while Huxley fine-tuned the voltage manually, both of them working in complete silence as the countdown reached 10 seconds. The system finally accepted the false signal, and the timer froze with 3 seconds remaining. For one long moment, the entire warehouse fell completely silent, and then the danger was simply over. Every surviving hostage was carried out into the daylight. Tobias, still breathing but critically wounded, was rushed into emergency care, while Owen was placed in restraints and led away without a word. Huxley looked at Donovan, who was still bleeding from the cut on his forearm, but the only question Donovan asked was how many hostages had been accounted for. Only after hearing that every single one of them was safe did he finally allow the medical team to treat his wound. Lena opened the hard drive one final time as the scene outside began to settle, scrolling through a list of names who had received payments from the laundering network over the years. Near the top of that list sat the name of a federal official currently standing inside the very command post overseeing the operation. The list stretched across hundreds of transactions, contracts, and coded aliases, one of which appeared repeatedly under the designation Gatekeeper. Lena cross-referenced the data and identified Gatekeeper as Deputy Director Malcolm Stowe, the official responsible for coordinating the entire operation from a remote command channel. Malcolm, it turned out, had been the one who sent the vague suspect description that led directly to Donovan's arrest on the perimeter. He had known Donovan was arriving that day and deliberately withheld the information, hoping the delay would keep him detained long enough for Tobias Owen and the incriminating evidence to be destroyed in the planned explosion. Donovan realized then that his mistreatment had not been pure coincidence, born of careless assumptions alone. Someone inside the system had deliberately exploited those assumptions, using existing bias as a weapon to remove him from the field entirely. Malcolm called into the command post shortly afterward, requesting that Owen and the hard drive be transferred immediately to a special extraction unit under his authority. Donovan pretended to comply quietly, asking Huxley to keep the discovery of Gatekeeper's true identity completely confidential. Huxley understood this was his chance to correct the failures of the day, and announced over an open channel that Donovan had been suspended from the operation for exceeding his authority. Malcolm believed his plan was still working exactly as intended. A federal transport convoy arrived shortly afterward to collect Owen, its commanding officer presenting transfer paperwork bearing Malcolm's digital signature. Donovan inspected the vehicles closely and noticed they were not registered anywhere in the official federal fleet system. The convoy, it turned out, was made up of hired mercenaries sent to kill Owen and seize the hard drive before it could be used against anyone above him. As the group moved into the designated handoff zone, Huxley sealed the gate behind them while agents surrounded the convoy from 3 directions at once. Donovan stepped out from behind an armored vehicle and ordered every weapon lowered immediately. The mercenary commander attempted to open fire regardless, but Marissa disarmed him before he could get a shot off, and the rest of the convoy surrendered without further resistance. Word of Malcolm's involvement spread quickly through the federal building, and several agents who had worked under him for years came forward on their own, describing small inconsistencies they had noticed but never questioned contracts. Approved without proper review files that vanished from shared servers, overnight meetings scheduled without any official record. None of them had suspected the full scale of what Malcolm had built, but each fragment they offered helped investigators construct a clearer picture of how long the network had operated undetected inside the very agency meant to stop it. Elaine Sutter issued an arrest warrant for Malcolm Stowe within the hour, and he was apprehended at an airport while attempting to leave the country on a forged passport. Lena confirmed that the evidence recovered was more than enough to launch a nationwide investigation into the laundering network and every official connected to it. Owen offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency, but Donovan made him no promises whatsoever. Tobias survived the surgery that followed his gunshot wound, and while he would still face serious consequences for orchestrating the hostage crisis, his testimony and the documents he had gathered would ultimately help expose the full scope of the corruption behind it. Huxley approached Donovan outside the ambulance bay, afterward apologizing not only for the handcuffs, but for ignoring every warning that had followed, for letting his own pride endanger the lives of everyone on that perimeter. Donovan told him plainly that an apology only mattered if it changed how his team identified threats going forward. Huxley agreed on the spot to launch a full review of interagency identification protocols and coordination procedures. The man who had been treated like a criminal that morning had become the one who saved the entire operation from a disaster, engineered from within its own ranks. As Donovan turned to leave, Elaine stopped him and explained that the government was forming a new task force to investigate the wider corruption network uncovered that day, and that she wanted him to lead it. 3 weeks later, federal officials held a press conference to announce the early results of the operation. Every hostage had survived. 7 suspects had been taken into custody. A senior federal official now faced formal prosecution, and more than $200 million sitting in illegal accounts had been frozen pending investigation. 14 federal contracts had been suspended while regulators combed through the surrounding paperwork. Reporters pressed Elaine Sutter for details on how a routine hostage situation had unraveled into one of the largest corruption cases the agency had seen in years, and she answered, carefully promising a full accounting once the investigation concluded, but making clear that no rank or title would shield anyone found to have participated in the network. Behind her, camera crews captured Donovan standing quietly near the back of the room, still in the same dark jacket that had gotten him mistaken for a criminal weeks earlier. Though this time no one looked at him with suspicion. Lena returned to work shortly afterward, taking charge of a newly formed special audit division, and made a point of publicly crediting Donovan with saving her life and protecting the evidence that made the entire prosecution possible. Huxley appeared at the press conference as well, offering no excuses for what had happened, admitting openly that his team had made a serious and dangerous error during the identification process at the start of the crisis. He announced a new training program focused on interagency coordination, identity verification, and controlling bias under high-pressure situations. Donovan refused to accept all of the credit being offered to him. He made a point of naming Marissa Huxley Callum, the ordnance team, and every agent who had worked alongside him to bring the hostages out alive. After the press conference ended, Elaine handed him the formal appointment, naming him commander of the new Special Investigative Unit. Donovan accepted the position on one condition: that the unit would hold authority to investigate any federal agency at all without exception. Elaine agreed without hesitation, noting that such an arrangement would likely make him unpopular among certain officials who preferred their departments left unexamined. A warning Donovan accepted with a small, unbothered nod. He had spent his entire career being underestimated by people who mistook calm for weakness, and he saw no reason that pattern would change simply because his title had. As he made his way out of the building afterward, Donovan passed a group of young agents standing near the entrance, and one of them recognized him instantly and straightened into a formal salute. Donovan paused, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, where a faint mark still lingered from the handcuffs that morning weeks earlier. He did not need to remind anyone that he had once been forced face down onto the pavement for simply looking like someone's careless assumption. The results had already spoken for themselves. People had once looked at an armed black man and instantly assumed he was the threat standing in front of them. But when every plan collapsed, every order turned to chaos, and the lives of the hostages were measured in seconds rather than minutes, it was that same man who stepped forward, took command, and brought every single one of them home. Donovan did not become a leader in the moment they finally handed him authority. He had already been a leader from the second they placed the cuffs on his wrists, because even in the middle of that humiliation, he never stopped putting the lives of others before his own.